The Crucible Horizon. Chapter 1. The 3-Day Shift. Act 1. The Geometry of Panic. The clock did not tick, it bled. Inside the belly of Valen's wake, time was measured by the violent, rhythmic thump-crunch of the primary ore masher, now retrofitted to chew through the military-grade hull plates of the Iron Hand. Leo hadn't slept in 48 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark grease circles from wiping his forehead with filthy sleeves. He sat on a flipped-over coolant crate on the command balcony, his fingers numb as he cross-referenced the ship's raw energy consumption against the dwindling hours. Alert. Critical power inversion. Main reactor. Output 88%. Overdrive. Forge induction rings 64%. Life support. Buffer 12%, 18 hours remaining. The oxygen scrubbers are clogging with lead dust, Captain, Leo said into his headset, his voice cracking with exhaustion. If we keep the induction rings at 1200 degrees for another 6 hours, the air in the lower barracks will turn to carbon monoxide. The miners won't even wake up to pour. Down on the forge deck, Sabine didn't look up from her workstation. She was using a pneumatic rivet gun to secure an oversized angular sheet of matte black armor, freshly stripped from the corvette's bow, directly over the forge ship's exposed cockpit glass. The deafening, rapid-fire chatter, chatter, chatter of the pneumatic gun echoing off the iron bulkheads. "Then tell them to sleep on the mid-decks," Sabine grunted, spitting a mouthful of bitter charcoal grit onto the floor. "Nobody gets clean air until the forward shielding is set. If the Directorate cruisers drop out of the gate and find our nose unprotected, their first rail shot will punch straight through the galley and out the engine exhaust." She slammed the rivet gun down and turned to face the center of the deck. The forge had been completely transformed. The neat, orderly rows of casting sand were gone, replaced by a chaotic labyrinth of heavy iron mold boxes. Liquid tungsten, salvaged copper, and the dark, calcified remains of the gravestalker were being mixed in a massive, open-topped crucible that hung from the ceiling like a swinging pendulum of fire. Standing beneath the crucible was Marrow. He was no longer the only one. Beside him stood 6 more miners, men and women who had volunteered to let the slate-gray frost claim their flesh rather than wait for the Directorate's execution squads. Their legs were thick, industrial columns of unpolished alloy bolted directly into their hips. They stood in perfect, unmoving unison, their magnetic sole plates locked to the deck, unaffected by the ship's erratic gravitational wobbles. "We are ready for the second template, Cap," Marrow rasped, his metallic voice cutting through the roar of the furnace. "The alloy is homogeneous. The chitin mix is stable." Act 2. The Assembly Line. The process had become mechanical, devoid of the horror that had accompanied Marrow's transformation. It was simply the work of the shift. Under Lyra's silent guidance, the 6 volunteers were strapped into the vertical casting frames. The gray girl stood on a central gantry above them, her silver-tipped fingers extended like the wires of a loom. She was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of molten metal and screaming nerves. "Do not fight the weight," Lyra commanded, her mercury eyes reflecting the white-hot glare of the pouring spouts. "The weight is your anchor. The weight is what keeps you here when the void tries to pull your consciousness apart." The subdermal weave, batch 02A. Lyra lowers the silver needles into the volunteer's upper thighs, mapping the femoral arteries and reinforcing the bone structures with microscopic titanium chitin threads before the hot pour begins. The volumetric pour, batch 02-B. Jarek tilts the main crucible, sending a brilliant, blinding orange stream of the tungsten lead alloy into the copper-lined molds. The smell of scorched insulation and treated leather fills the deck. The magnetic temper. Batch 02C. Marrow activates his own internal biosonar, sending a low, vibrating pulse through the cooling molds to align the metallic molecules, hardening the scrap into ballistic-grade plating within seconds. A young miner named Vance, barely 20, his arms covered in old refinery scars, let out a choked, desperate sob as the slate-gray patina raced up his stomach, freezing his abdominal muscles into rigid metallic plates. "Hold on, kid," Jarek growled, stepping up to the frame and jamming a thick piece of cured rubber between the boy's teeth. "Don't bite your tongue off. The cold's coming. Once the gray takes the spine, the pain stops. Just look at me. Look at the furnace." Vance bit down, his eyes bulging as the metallic sheen rolled over his neck, stopping precisely at his jawline. His breathing instantly stabilized, turning into that same unnaturally deep, mechanical respiration that Marrow possessed. Act 3. The Horizon opens. "Captain!" Leo's scream over the Vox was so sharp it caused Sabine to wince inside her helmet. "Telemetry change. They're early. They aren't coming from the rim gate." Sabine scrambled up the iron ladder to the command balcony, her heavy boots clattering against the rungs. She shoved Leo aside and stared at the primary long-range sensor scope. The green static on the monitor wasn't showing 3 distinct cruiser signatures anymore. It was showing a massive, continuous distortion, a tear in the local magnetic field that was widening like an ink stain on white cloth. "They used a gravity well compress," Sabine whispered, her blood running cold. "They didn't cruise in. They dragged a localized gate window right into the outer edge of the scrap belt. Through the forward viewports, past the freshly riveted, matte black armor plates, the dark void of the asteroid field began to ripple. The shattered remnants of the old freighters and mining tailings were suddenly pulled toward a central point, spinning violently like debris caught in a whirlpool. A single colossal silhouette began to emerge from the distortion. It wasn't a flotilla. It was a single vessel, but it was larger than any 3 Directorate cruisers combined. A Vanguard-class dreadnought, designated the Sovereign's Gavel. Its hull was a brutal, multi-layered wedge of dark iron, its forward prow dominated by a triple-barreled magnetic rail cannon that was already glowing with the pale violet light of an active charge cycle. "They didn't send a recovery team," Leo whispered, his voice trembling as the terminal screen reflected the violet bloom of the enemy's weapon. "They came to erase the entire sector." Sabine looked down at the forge deck. The 6 new Scrap-Born were just stepping out of their iron molds, their unpolished slate-gray limbs smoking in the cold air, their metallic eyes turning toward the ceiling as they felt the massive gravitational shift in their new bones. "7 of them," Sabine muttered, her hand tightening on the rail until the iron groaned. 7 Scrap-Born against an Empire's hammer. She turned back to Leo, her visor reflecting the oncoming violet light. "Leo, clear the heat sinks. Jarek, drop the forge straight into the main drive. If we're going to die in this furnace, we're going to make sure they smell the smoke." Act 2. The Crucible Shield. The violet glare of the dreadnought's rail cannon didn't just fill the viewports, it hummed inside the fillings of Leo's teeth. The air in the comms nest felt heavy, thick with the static charge of an approaching lightning strike. "Charging sequence is at 90%, Leo yelled, slamming his palms against the console to clear a cascading series of system failures. "The targeting telemetry is locked right on our engineering bay. If that rail slug hits us, it's going to turn the reactor into a cloud of radioactive dust before the hull even has time to buckle." Sabine reached for the main thruster clutch, her knuckles turning white inside her heavy work gloves. "Jarek, give me everything we've got on the lateral jets. We have to swing the nose into the rock." "It will not matter," Lyra's voice was a flat line, slicing cleanly through the panic. She stood at the very edge of the forge gantry, her silver-tipped fingers hovering inches above the open, white-hot surface of the central crucible. The remaining tungsten chitin slurry inside was a churning pool of liquid fire, reacting violently to the massive electromagnetic field being generated by the approaching dreadnought. "Lyra, get away from the pour!" Jarek roared, reaching for her shoulder with a greasy hand. "The induction coils are blowing their safeties. It's going to blast." "The template is not just a mold for limbs," Lyra said, her mercury eyes wide, staring deep into the incandescent metal. She didn't flinch as a stray spark of white-hot alloy spat out, searing a black line across her slate-gray cheek. "The alloy is a sponge for kinetic and magnetic force. It was woven to survive the pressure of the deep crust. It can catch the hammer." She looked up at Sabine on the balcony. "But to make it catch, we must give it a path, a circuit." "Speak plain, girl," Sabine shouted over the rising whine of the enemy's rail cannon. "We have less than 40 seconds. We can route the main reactor's plasma directly through the forge's induction rings and into the outer hull plating," Lyra explained, her silver fingers finally dropping into the liquid metal. She didn't scream. Her jaw simply locked as the silver threads in her flesh turned red-hot under her skin. "The tungsten chitin weave we just riveted to the nose will polarize. It will create a localized barrier, an anchor in space that the rail slug cannot pass." "And the cost?" Sabine asked, her hand freezing on the clutch. She knew the economy of the forge. Nothing was given without something of equal weight being taken. "The plasma will vaporize the ship's internal conduits," Lyra said, her words coming slower now, vibrating with the rhythm of the ship's laboring engines. "The lower decks will burn, the automated cranes, the fabricators, the secondary Vox arrays. They will melt from the inside out. We will save our lives, but Valen's wake will be left a blind, deaf cripple in the dark." Tactical telemetry. Emergency override. Dreadnought rail cannon, 98% charge. Time to impact 14 seconds. "Captain, the bridge is starting to smoke." Leo panicked, his monitors flickering wildly as the ambient static rose to lethal levels. "Decision. Now." Sabine looked down at the 6 new Scrap-Born. They stood by their casting frames, their heavy slate limbs locked to the deck plates, waiting. They had given up their humanity to survive this war. She could do no less for the ship that carried them. "Jarek, blow the reactor safeties," Sabine commanded, her voice dropping into a hard, flat stone. "Route the plasma down Lyra's throat." Jarek didn't hesitate. He grabbed the emergency red-handled lever on the deck wall, the one protected by a pane of scored plasteel, and slammed his heavy boot through the glass, ripping the lever downward. System notification. Primary coolant loops severed. Reactor output unbounded. External hull polarization initialized. The shift didn't happen on the screens. It happened in the marrow of their bones. A blinding arc of violet-white plasma shot out from the main conduit behind the crucible, striking Lyra directly between her shoulder blades. Her body went entirely rigid, her silver skin glowing so brightly it cast long, skeletal shadows against the bulkheads. Through her fingers, the liquid tungsten chitin alloy in the crucible boiled over, racing down the drainage channels like streams of liquid lightning. It didn't pool on the floor. It followed the copper lines Leo had laid, standardizing across the entire forward framework of Valen's wake. Outside, the matte black armor plates on the ship's nose began to hum, a pale iridescent green web of magnetic lines snapping into existence just as the dreadnought fired. The universe went completely silent as the rail slug met the shield. Act 3. The Smoldering Ribs. The green phosphor world was gone. The silence that had swallowed the rail slug's impact shattered into a chorus of screaming iron. Valen's wake groaned like a dying beast, its skeletal framework buckling as the plasma backfeed melted the primary distribution lines. The air was no longer just thin. It was a toxic soup of vaporized copper and scorched rubber that tasted like copper coins under the tongue. "Leo, out of the chair!" Sabine yelled, coughing violently as she dragged the boy off the command balcony. The floor plates beneath them were already hot enough to blister bare skin, the gray paint curling up into black ash. "The comms deck is a chimney. Move." "The armory," Leo choked out, clutching a dead manual data slate to his chest. "Captain, the automated fire suppression in Deck 4 blew its fuses. If the heat triggers the lead slug stockpiles, the whole forward bow goes up." "Not on my watch," a voice rumbled from the smoke below. Jarek materialized through the thick haze, his single organic eye streaming tears from the acrid fumes, his heavy welding apron blackened and smoking. He carried a long iron pry bar across his shoulder like a club. Behind him huddled 8 of the remaining non-augmented crew, grease monkeys, cooks, and refinery hands, clutching wet rags over their mouths, their faces white with terror. "The main lifts are slagged, Sabine," Jarek growled, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The only way down to the magazine is through the vent shafts behind the primary induction ring, and that ring is still sitting at 900 degrees. "Then we carry what we can and we crawl," Sabine said, snapping her visor down. The HUD blinked thrice, starved for power before dying completely. She was blind to telemetry now. She had to rely on the shape of the metal she had lived in for a decade. "Move out. Keep your heads below the yellow line." Act 2. The Throat of the Furnace. The descent into Deck 4 was an exercise in industrial survival. The structural ribs of the ship were glowing a dull, angry cherry red, radiating a heat that made the air shimmer. "Vent the pressure shunts." Deck 3. Junction. Jarek uses the iron pry bar to manually jam open the emergency blowout valves, releasing a jet of superheated steam away from the crew's path and clearing the stairwell visibility. The wet rag bridge. The induction gap. Sabine douses the crew's jackets in recycled coolant water, forcing the non-augmented workers to sprint across a collapsing catwalk suspended directly over the white-hot induction coils. Manual cold cut. Magazine door. With the electronic locks melted shut, Jarek and Sabine use a manual hydraulic jack to deform the blast door, creating a narrow, jagged gap just wide enough for a human hip. "The crates are sweating," Leo yelled, pointing through the gap into the dim, smoke-filled armory. Inside, rows of heavy wooden and zinc ammunition boxes were stacked against the bulkhead. The high-tensile lead slugs and the volatile chemical primers for the ship's defense turrets were stowed here. The paint on the zinc boxes was already bubbling, releasing a sweet, deadly lead gas into the small space. "Grab the heavy-caliber boxes first," Sabine commanded, shoving a worker toward the gap. "Leave the casing tools. If it fires a slug, it goes up the ladder. Hand-to-hand chain. Now." The non-augmented crew formed a frantic, desperate line along the blistering rungs of the vent shaft. They didn't have the hydraulic hips or the cold-resistant slate skin of Marrow's cast. Every time a zinc crate was passed, skin hissed against hot metal. Someone screamed as a corner gouged a forearm, but the box didn't drop. It couldn't. "That's 20 boxes," Jarek panted, his muscles straining as he lifted a 60-pound crate of rail darts through the jagged hole. "The bulkheads are shifting, Sabine. The dreadnought's gravity well is pulling the external plating apart." A violent structural shudder tore through Valen's wake. The floor plates beneath Jarek's boots skewed 45 degrees as a support pillar snapped with the sound of a cannon shot. Act 3. The final haul. "Out! Everybody out!" Sabine roared, shoving Leo toward the ladder as the ceiling of the magazine began to rain molten rivet heads. The non-augmented workers scrambled up the shaft, dragging the heavy ammunition crates by their thick canvas handles. Their fingers were bloody, their lungs burning with the toxic atmosphere of a ship being turned inside out. But they didn't leave a single round behind. Jarek stayed at the base of the ladder, his massive frame wedged against the buckling frame of the blast door to keep it from snapping shut on Sabine. "Sabine, get up the pipe!" he shouted, his face turning purple under the strain. Sabine grabbed the last container, a small, heavy, lead-lined case containing the remaining high-yield detonators. As she swung her leg onto the bottom rung of the ladder, she looked back through the smoke toward the forward bow. Through a tear in the internal hull, she could see the outer void. The iridescent green web Lyra had cast was gone, replaced by a dull, dead gray. And out there, looming larger by the second, the Sovereign's gavel was drifting closer, its secondary battery turrets tracking the dark, silent silhouette of the Ford ship. They had saved the teeth, but the jaw was broken. "I'm up," Sabine yelled, hauling herself into the relatively cool air of the mid-deck commons, just as the magazine below collapsed into a heap of white-hot slag. Jarek scrambled up behind her, rolling onto the deck plates as the hatch was slammed shut and bolted with a manual iron pin. The 8 survivors lay scattered across the floor, drawing ragged, painful breaths from the emergency oxygen masks Leo was handing out. They were burned, blind with soot, and completely exhausted, but they were alive. And at their center sat 21 crates of military-grade ammunition. "We have the lead," Jarek panted, looking up at Sabine through his one good eye. Sabine unlatched her helmet, letting the cold, stale air of the middeck hit her sweaty face. She looked down at the crates, then toward the lower forge where the silent, heavy footsteps of Marrow and the Scrap-Born were beginning to echo up the stairs. "Good," Sabine said, her teeth showing through a face smeared with charcoal. "Now, let's go give it back to them. One bullet at a time." Act 1. The Blind Approach. Valen's wake was a ghost ship of hot iron. Without the main reactor to pump power through the distribution grids, the interior halls had gone completely dark, illuminated only by the dying orange glow of the cooling plasma conduits. The ship drifted sideways through the asteroid field, a half-melted chunk of refinery slag rolling in the shadow of hollow rock. In the pilot's nest, Leo was working by the light of a single chemical glow stick, cracked and taped to his console. The primary screens were dead, black mirrors reflecting his own hollow, terrified face. System readout. Critical fallback. Auxiliary battery, 14%. Engine registry, no response. Active sensors, defunct. Passive acoustic. Audio, operational. "I can't see them, Captain," Leo whispered into his headset, his chest tight against his bruised ribs. "The sensor arrays are slagged. I'm tracking the dreadnought by the sound of its internal stabilizers vibrating through the asteroid dust. They're closing at 4 knots. They think we're a dead hull." "Good." Sabine's voice came back through the short-range, sound-powered phones, ancient copper lines that didn't require a single volt of electricity. "Let them get close enough to smell the grease." She was standing on the lower loading gantry, right above the main cargo airlock. The air here was freezing now, the heat from the forge rapidly escaping through microfractures in the outer hull. Her breath plumed in the dim light of Jarek's hand torch. Beside her, the 7 Scrap-Born stood in a silent, heavy row. They didn't need oxygen masks. They didn't even seem to notice the sub-zero cold setting into the deck plates. Marrow stood at the head of the file, his slate-gray forearms resting against the grip of his industrial spike driver. The 6 new recruits, including young Vance, whose face was now half shrouded in the cold, unyielding metallic patina, looked less like miners and more like statues cast from unpolished industrial iron. The dreadnought's shields are down to 30% on their forward quadrant, Jarek muttered, leaning over a manual trajectory table with a grease pencil. They took a heavy hit from their own rail cannon backfeed when Lyra's barrier snapped. If we drop from the belly now, the drift will carry us straight into their secondary launch bay before their automated point defense can cycle. No engines means no heat signature, Sabine said, her hand checking the mechanical latch on her scattergun. We're just 7 million tons of tumbling space debris until the moment we hit their skin. Act 2. The Gravity Leap. Lyra stepped out from the shadows of the gantry. She looked frail compared to the massive armored forms of the Scrap-Born, her silver skin dulled and streaked with soot from the plasma burst. But her eyes were still pools of pure, unblinking mercury. The dreadnought is not a ship, Lyra said, her multi-layered voice small but perfectly clear in the cold air. It is an extension of the Corps' mind. The soldiers inside do not think like you. They obey the rhythm of the central lattice. If you break the lattice at the sensory tower, the limbs will go dark. Then we start at the tower, Maro rasped, his voice vibrating with a metallic resonance that matched the ship's groaning framework. He turned his gray eyes toward Sabine. Captain, give the word. Sabine didn't waste time on a speech. These men and women had worked the deep shifts with her for years. They knew how to survive a cave-in, and they knew how to clear a vein. This was just a different kind of rock. Jarek, blow the manual locks, Sabine said. The cold vent, airlock decompression. Jarek turns the heavy brass wheel of the auxiliary relief valve, allowing the remaining atmosphere in the staging bay to hiss out into the void, preventing an explosive decompression that would alert the dreadnought. The drift drop, magnetic release. Maro and the 6 Scrap-Born deactivate their magnetic soul plates simultaneously. The weight of their heavy alloy bodies causes them to slide silently out of the open belly hatch into the absolute dark. The high tensile anchor. The tether line. Sabine fires a pneumatic steel anchoring cable from the cargo winch, securing a silent physical link between Valen's wake and the dreadnought's unshielded belly armor. The void swallowed them without a sound. Through the open hatch, Sabine watched the 7 Scrap-Born drift through the blackness like a cluster of discarded iron ingots. They didn't use thrusters. They used their massive structural density to fall toward the Sovereign's gavel, completely invisible to the dreadnought's electronic eyes. Act 3. The Skin of the Sovereign. The dreadnought's hull was a mountain of polished black composite material, vast and flat enough to have its own faint gravitational pull. Maro was the first to hit. His magnetic plates engaged instantly, his boots locking to the dreadnought's skin with a sharp clack. Within 3 seconds, the other 6 were down around him, forming a tight defensive perimeter on the massive vessel's exterior. "We're on the skin," Maro rasped over the short-range bone conduction comms. "The plating here is 3 feet thick. Standard torches won't scratch it." "You aren't using torches, Maro," Sabine's voice came through his skull, faint but steady from the tether line. "Vance, step up." The young Scrap-Born miner stepped to the center of the ring. His right arm, from the elbow down, had been cast into an oversized pneumatic piston, originally used for shattering granite deep in the tunnels of hollow rock. He didn't look back toward Valen's wake. He knelt, pressing the hardened tungsten tip of the driver directly against the seams of the dreadnought's armor plates. 3 shifts of pressure, Vance muttered, the mechanical lungs in his chest expanding with a dry, rhythmic hiss. "Let's see if this core iron can hold its teeth." He pulled the manual trigger on his forearm. Act 2. The Iron Ingress. The spike driver didn't bang. It hummed. Vance's arm vibrated so violently the slate-gray patina on his neck cracked like dry mud. The hardened tungsten tip found the seam between two colossal hull plates of the Sovereign's gavel and began to cycle at 4,000 strokes a minute. Audio cue, a high-pitched, tooth-grinding drill scream that vibrated through the metal hull directly into the soles of the boarding party's boots. "The seam is parting," Marrow rasped, his gray fingers digging into the lip of the lifting armor plate like iron clamps. "The seal under the plate is standard rubberized lead. It's brittle from the void." With a final massive surge from his hydraulic hips, Marrow ripped the 3-inch thick military plate clean off its housing, tossing it into the dark behind him. Beneath lay the soft underbelly of the secondary launch bay, a web of fiber optic cables and pneumatic fuel lines. Marrow raised his industrial spike driver, rammed it through the pressurized inner seal, and squeezed the release. Inside the secondary launch bay, the decompression was violent but brief. The air inside the secondary bay hissed out into the void in a white plume of ice crystals, dragging with it a few loose tools and maintenance slates before the emergency bulkheads 3 levels up could register the pressure drop. Marrow dropped through the jagged breach first, his heavy boots denting the polished steel grating of the catwalk. The 6 new Scrap-Born followed him in a rapid, heavy cadence, landing without a sound in the vacuum-struck room. The launch bay was vast, filled with rows of sleek, unmanned Directorate interceptors, hanging from overhead crane rails like dormant wasps. The air was entirely gone, leaving the room in a crystalline, high-contrast silence. Then the red lights came on. "Security alert, Section 12, B breach. Countermeasures engaged. Automated defense grid. Unit type, Scythe 04. Targeting status, active." From the ceiling tracks above the interceptors, 4 long metallic shapes detached themselves. They weren't humanoid. They were sleek, multi-limbed spheres of polished chrome, their periscope eyes glowing with a cold blue optical light. 3-barreled rotary fléchette guns extended from their undercarriages, tracking the heavy, unmoving forms of the miners. "Drones," Vance muttered over the short-range bone conduction comms. "They're fast." The first drone opened fire. Because there was no air, there was no sound. Only the blinding, strobing flash of the muzzle cores and the instantaneous ricochet of thousands of high-velocity steel needles off the Scrap-Born's new tungsten chitin armor. Form the shield wall. Fléchette Wave 01. Marrow and a veteran miner named Gara stepped to the front, interlocking their massive slate-gray forearms to form a makeshift ballistic wall that catches the brunt of the high-velocity needle stream. The spike drift. Counter battery. Vance uses the zero-gravity environment to launch himself off the catwalk, using his pneumatic arm piston as a kinetic pile driver to smash the center of the first chrome drone. The lead dust cleanse. Grid disruption. The remaining 4 Scrap-Born unpack their salvaged mining charges, scattering a thick cloud of magnetic lead shavings into the air to clog the optical sensors of the remaining security units. The lead dust worked instantly. The 3 remaining drones spun erratically, their blue optical eyes blinded by the cloud of highly reflective mining tailings floating in the zero-gravity air. Their fléchette guns fired blindly into the ceiling, chewing through their own ship's hanging fuel lines. Marrow didn't waste the opening. He closed the distance in 2 heavy magnetic bounds, his iron hands reaching out to grab the second drone by its chrome weapon mounts. With a brutal twist of his hydraulic wrists, he sheared the rotary guns off their bearings and jammed the broken metal directly back into the drone's glowing blue eye. The machine sparked violently, its internal battery cell leaking a bright stream of green caustic fluid that boiled instantly in the vacuum. Vance landed back on the catwalk beside him, his pneumatic arms smoking with hot hydraulic fluid. 2 down. The secondary access lift is just past the interceptor racks, Marrow, but the main security lattice is already locking the inner doors. Marrow looked toward the far end of the bay. Through the cloud of floating lead dust and green battery fluid, a massive, reinforced blast door was slowly sliding into place, sealing the launch bay off from the ship's primary interior corridors. "We don't use the doors," Marrow rasped, his gray face tightening as he locked his boots back onto the deck grating. "We're miners. We go through the floor." Act 3. The Frost Pipe Vein. The blast doors groaned as they settled into their deep steel tracks, the final thud vibrating through the deck plates of the secondary launch bay. The chamber was entirely sealed now, a dead-end pocket of vacuum and floating lead dust. "The lattice is sealing the whole sector," Vance rasped, his bone conduction comms translating his heavy breathing into a dry, static hiss. "If they run a hard diagnostic from the bridge, they'll see the pressure drop in this bay wasn't a micrometeorite. They'll flush the compartment with microwave radiation to cook whatever's left inside." Marrow didn't look at the doors. He was already down on his knees, his massive stone-gray fingers clawing at the seams of the deck grating. "I told you, we don't use doors. Find the main circulatory trunk. Every dreadnought of this class carries a liquid nitrogen coolant line right beneath the launch bays to chill the interceptor capacitors." The 6 new Scrap-Born dropped to the deck, using the sharpened heels of their mining boots and the heavy edges of their spike drivers to rip away the polished steel floor plating. They worked with the fluid, brutal efficiency of men who had spent 20 years racing a collapsing roof in the dark. Beneath the grating lay the ship's dark nervous system, bundles of thick braided copper wiring, fiber optic channels glowing with data pulses, and 3 massive vacuum-insulated conduits frosted over with a thick crust of white rime. "Here," Vance said, tapping the largest pipe with his pneumatic piston. The metal gave off a dull, brittle clink. "Liquid ammonia and compressed nitrogen. It feeds the lower engine deck's heat exchangers. If we rupture this, the pressure differential will dump thousands of gallons into the main subfloor conduits. And it will trigger every environmental alarm from here to the bridge," Marrow said. He reached down, grabbing the frozen collar of the pipe with his bare, tungsten-etched hands. The intense cold immediately began to freeze the slate-gray patina of his skin, turning it a brittle, chalky white, but he didn't let go. "Vance, position your driver. We need a clean, structural fracture. 1 hit." Vance stepped over the trench, locking his magnetic soles to the structural ribs of the ship. He tilted his right forearm down, aligning the hardened tungsten tip of the pile driver with the primary weld on the frost pipe. "Hold your breath," Vance muttered, then remembered there was no air to hold. He pulled the manual trigger. The rupture. The driver struck with 20 tons of hydraulic force. Because they were in a vacuum, there was no explosive roar, only an instantaneous blinding flash of white as the high-pressure liquid ammonia flashed into a violent storm of frozen crystals upon hitting the void. The pressure within the pipe tore the conduit open like a burst lung, spewing a torrent of sub-zero liquid straight down into the subfloor channels. The torrent. Conduit fracture. The high-pressure chemical sludge erupts from the pipe, instantly filling the narrow crawl space below the deck with a freezing pressurized fog that coats every surface in thick, pale ice. The structural tear. Thermal shock. The extreme cold causes the surrounding structural steel of the deck to become instantly brittle, allowing Marrow to smash an oversized hole through the subfloor plating with a single kick. Into the vent well. The diversion drop. The 7 Scrap-Born drop through the newly made tear, riding the freezing torrent of coolant down into the primary ventilation shafts that lead straight toward the lower engine decks. 3 decks below, inside the primary environmental routing hub, the sudden influx of thousands of gallons of freezing ammonia hit the active electrical relays. The ship's internal monitoring system went completely frantic. Critical system fault, deck 15 to 17. Primary coolant line, cold rupture detected. Electrical fire hazard. Relays 09 through 14 short-circuited. Automated response, diverting all security lattices to lower engine containment. Through the thick, frozen haze of the ventilation shaft, Marrow could hear the distant, structural bells of the dreadnought ringing, the physical vibrations of the ship's emergency sirens traveling through the structural iron. Above them, the security cameras and the automated drone tracks went dark as the Directorate's central mind scrambled to cut power to the flooded decks, diverting every available repair unit and security drone away from the launch bay and down into the burning, short-circuited engine rooms. Marrow hauled himself up onto a dry maintenance catwalk, the frozen ammonia crackling and peeling away from his metallic chest plate like shedding skin. He looked down into the dark, frozen well of the ventilation shaft as his crew climbed out, one by one, their newly cast alloy limbs dripping with white frost, but entirely undamaged by the chemical storm. The diversion worked, Vance rasped, his mechanical lungs clearing a puff of frozen vapor from his internal vents. The lower decks are screaming. The bridge thinks they're having a reactor meltdown. Marrow looked forward, down the long, unprotected service tunnel that led straight toward the secondary sensory tower. The security gates ahead were wide open, their electronic locks dead and starved for power. "Then the road is clear," Marrow said, his heavy boots clacking against the dry steel of the catwalk as he raised his spike driver. "Let's go take the eyes." Act 1. The Ghost in the Conduit. The signal from Marrow's team arrived not as a radio pulse, but as a low structural thrum that traveled up the high-tensile copper tether line and rattled the teeth of everyone still inside Valen's wake. In the pitch-black cockpit, the single chemical glow stick taped to Leo's console cast long green-tinted shadows across his face as the passive acoustic needles suddenly jumped. Acoustic diagnostic, tether, register, vibration, spike, 4.2 kilohertz, structural rupture verified, external shield radiance, 0%, sector 12B. Directorate, calm traffic, erratic cascade. They did it, Leo breathed into the copper telephone pipe, his fingers flying across a mechanical tally counter to track the ship's drifting orbit. "Captain, the Sovereign's gavel just pulled its secondary defensive field back by 300 meters to cover its engine core. The launch bay is completely bare." "Jarek, give me the line," Sabine ordered. She was perched on the lip of the open cargo hatch, her knees locked into the manual safety harness. The bitter chill of open space had already crawled up her flight suit, deadening the sensation in her fingers, but her grip on the heavy winch clutch was steady. Jarek leaned over the manual winch drum, his massive, grease-slicked welding apron stiffening in the radiating cold. With one hand, he hauled back on the mechanical brake lever, releasing the tension on the thick copper tungsten cable just enough to let it sag into the shadow of the dreadnought's hull. "The line's slack, Sabine," Jarek grunted, his breath freezing into a thick cloud of white crystal before the vacuum pulled it away. "But you've only got about 4 minutes of battery left in that pneumatic winch before the grease freezes solid into stone. If you're going down the pipe, you go now. Beside them, Lyra stood perfectly still on the open ledge, her long silver hair floating around her head like a halo of liquid wire. Her eyes were fixed on the distant dark spire of the secondary sensory tower looming over the dreadnought's upper spine like a jagged black tooth. The central mind is blinded by the ammonia fog, but it is already constructing a bypass, Lyra warned, her voice vibrating through the copper line with a strange, metallic echo. If the lattice resets before Marrow cuts the primary fiber trunk, the drones in the upper tiers will wake up, and they will not be blind. Then we make sure they stay asleep, Sabine said. She kicked herself free of the safety harness, grabbing the heavy brass sliding shackle hooked to the tether line. Jarek, watch the drift. If the hull shifts, cut the cable and run for the rocks. Not a chance, Captain, Jarek growled, his single organic eye locked onto her visor. Bring me back something to patch this engine with. Act 2. The Slide. The drop down the tether line was a silent, terrifying fall through 300 meters of absolute nothingness. Clear the hull wake. The launch. Sabine pushes off from the cargo lip of Valen's wake, using her weight to drive the brass shackle down the copper cable, leaving the dead refinery ship behind in the dark. The shackle break. The midnight friction. As the velocity increases halfway through the drift, Sabine uses her reinforced leather gauntlets to manually squeeze the shackle, controlling the friction to prevent her boots from smashing into the dreadnought's armor. The magnetic clamp, the touchdown. Hitting the unshielded plating of the secondary launch bay, Sabine drops into a low crouch, engaging her suit's manual magnetic hip clamps to lock herself onto the Sovereign's gavel. Lyra landed beside her a second later, her bare, silver-skinned feet making contact with the cold composite hull without a single spark or sound. She didn't use magnets. Her body simply seemed to adapt to the molecular structure of the metal beneath her, anchoring her in place against the slight centrifugal tug of the turning dreadnought. The entry point Vance had cleared was a jagged, frost-rimed wound in the ship's skin. The cloud of ammonia crystals was still venting into space, casting a pale, iridescent mist over the surrounding armor plates. Sabine dropped through the hole first, her scattergun held tight against her shoulder. The launch bay was dead silent now. The 3 destroyed drones lay scattered across the lower catwalks like crushed chrome beetles, their green battery fluids frozen into bright, glassy stalactites that hung from the split floor plates. The air was long gone, but the heavy odor of chemical frost and scorched electronics lingered inside Sabine's helmet filters. "Marrow," Sabine called out through the bone conduction comms, her voice rattling through her own jawbone. "We're inside the bay. What's your status at the tower?" For 3 seconds there was only the dry, rhythmic scratching of static. Then Marrow's voice cut through, low, heavy, and punctuated by the distant metallic thud of his spike driver. "We've reached the base of the tower trunk, Captain," Marrow rasped. "The internal security doors here are dead, but the Directorate is routing auxiliary power from the bridge through the backup conduits. The lines are live, they're humming like a hornet's nest. Can you cut them?" "We can smash 'em," Marrow replied. "But the moment we crack the housing, the voltage backfeed is going to blow every relay between here and your position. The lights are coming back on, Sabine, and we've got movement in the rafters." Act 3. The Rafters Wake. Above Sabine and Lyra, the long rows of hanging Directorate interceptors began to twitch. The ship's central lattice hadn't reset, but the bridge had managed to force a manual override through the auxiliary lines. One by one, the sleek, triangular fighter craft began to hum, their automated navigation lights shifting from dead black to a blinking, menacing yellow. Audio cue. a low, deep register power growl that vibrated through the steel support pillars of the bay as the interceptor charging racks re-energized. "The fighters," Sabine muttered, backing toward the shadow of a heavy structural column. "They're turning on their internal point defense." From the underbelly of the nearest interceptor, a pair of small, automated turret lenses dropped down, their optical tracking arrays sweeping the dark catwalks with thin, yellow laser lines. One of the beams skipped across the edge of Sabine's boot. "Lyra, get down!" Sabine hissed. But Lyra didn't move. She stepped out into the open center of the catwalk, her silver hands extended toward the hanging interceptor like a weaver approaching a loom. The yellow tracking laser hit her square in the chest, painting a bright amber circle over her heart, but the automated guns didn't fire. The turret simply trembled, its internal gears whining as the machine tried to process the entity standing before it. "The lattice is a song," Lyra whispered, her fingers twitching in perfect synchronization with the data pulses blinking along the interceptor's canopy. "And they have forgotten the old chords." She reached out and pressed her bare palm against the fighter's main diagnostic port. Act 2. The Sovereign's Current. Inside the central trunk of the sensory tower, 4 levels below Sabine's position, the air felt thick enough to chew. It wasn't atmospheric pressure, it was the pure static ionization bleeding from the backup conduits. The main power lines here were thick as a man's thigh, wrapped in heavy yellow lead composite insulation that bulged under the strain of the auxiliary surge forced from the bridge. "The core is pushing a hard bypass," Vance muttered, his visor screen flickering with bright green distortion lines every time he drew near the conduit trunk. "They're bypassing the safety breakers entirely. If we crack this line while it's running at maximum variance, the arc flash will turn the iron in this room to liquid vapor." Marrow stood at the base of the primary junction box, his heavy mining boots locked to the floor plates. His gray chest plate was hot to the touch, radiating the static charge building in the air. "We don't break the line," Marrow rasped, his voice buzzing with heavy distortion over the short-range comms. "We ground it. Vance, get the copper grounding spikes into the structural ribs of the hull. Gara, set the kinetic wedge." The Scrap-Born moved with frantic precision. Because the room was still pressurized with residual cabin air, they could hear the terrible, low-register honk, honk, honk of the high-voltage warnings echoing through the bulkheads. The yellow lines on the junction box were already beginning to char, the synthetic insulation smoking as the Directorate's bridge crew desperately poured juice into the lower bays to wake up the defensive grid. The grounding. Gara rammed a massive 3-foot wedge of raw copper directly into the seam between the main power housing and the ship's massive structural frame. Vance followed instantly, using his pneumatic arm to drive 2 heavy grounding leads deep into the floor plates, welding them to the naked iron core of the dreadnought with a brief, blinding flash of white sparks. "The line is anchored to the hull now," Vance said, stepping back as his hydraulic arm hissed, venting pressurized steam to cool its overworked pistons. "But the moment you strike that main line, Marrow, the whole ship is going to act as the return path. Your armor's tungsten-chitin mix. It'll take the heat, but your internal neural links might fry." Marrow didn't answer. He raised his heavy industrial spike driver, adjusting the stroke rate to its maximum depth. The tip of the tungsten spike glowed a dull, warning orange just from the ambient static in the room. "Sabine," Marrow called over the bone conduction channel, his teeth rattling from the current vibrating through his skull. "Tell the girl to take her hand off that fighter. We're cutting the throat now. Drive the wedge, the contact strike." Marrow drives the spike driver directly through the yellow lead composite insulation. The tungsten tip hits the core copper line, instantly creating a blinding blue arc flash that illuminates the entire sensory trunk. The overload loop, the thermal cascade. The forced auxiliary power from the bridge slams into the copper grounding wedge. Instead of feeding the launch bay interceptors, the current redirects into the massive iron framework of the ship itself. The secondary blackout. The breaker blow. 4 levels up, the auxiliary transformers inside the secondary launch bay explode in a chain reaction of white phosphorus fire, instantly starving the waking interceptors of power. The effect was instantaneous. Inside the launch bay, the yellow laser lines sweeping the catwalks from the underside of the interceptors flickered once, turned a deep blood red, and then vanished. The low, deep register power growl of the fighter engines died in a long, descending whine like a beast going to sleep. Down in the sensory tower, Maro was thrown backward into the steel bulkhead by the sheer kinetic force of the electrical repulsion. His spike driver was gone, its tungsten head completely melted into a smooth, metallic lump that was now welded permanently to the ruptured conduit trunk. Thick, black smoke poured from the seams of his shoulder joints, and the gray patina across his face was webbed with glowing, red-hot spiderweb fractures. Vance scrambled over the smoking floor, grating, his mechanical arm tearing away Maro's charred chest plate to check the internal battery cells. "Maro, talk to me, you old rock biter," Vance roared through the comms. Maro's eyes flickered open, the cold blue light of his optical implants dimming down to a faint, dull ember before slowly surging back to life. He spat a mouthful of dark, metallic fluid onto the floor and hauled himself back onto his knees. "The bay is dark," Maro growled, his voice hoarser than usual, his iron fingers testing the movement of his wrists. "Tell the captain she's got a free shot at the sensory arrays, because we just burned the bridge's fingers." Act 3. The Sensory Vault. The silence inside the primary sensory core was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. With the auxiliary power line vaporized by Maro's team below, the great tower was nothing more than a hollow iron tomb. The only light came from the narrow beams of Sabine's shoulder-mounted lamps, cutting through the thick black curls of smoking lead insulation that drifted lazily in the zero-gravity air. Sabine pulled herself through the ruptured inner hatch, her magnetic boots clicking softly as they found purchase on the central spire's structural ribs. "Maro, we're inside the vault. The primary data stacks are dead, no active internal defenses." "Copy that, Captain," Vance's voice crackled back, faint and laced with heavy static from the lower decks. "But don't get comfortable. The bridge is already cycling the backup to the backup. They're going to try a mechanical hard reset on the core systems. You've got 5 minutes before the data lines burn hot again." The core was a vertical well of obsidian glass computing slates, thousands of them arranged in a perfect, interlocking cylinder that stretched 50 feet toward the apex of the tower. These weren't standard silicone drives, they were high-fidelity directorate crystalline matrices, designed to store centuries of navigational star charts, sector, jump coordinates, and encrypted military flight logs. "Where's the physical ledger?" Sabine asked, her light sweeping the endless rows of dark, reflective glass. "Lyra, I can't read these markings. They look like old sector coordinates, but the symbols are wrong." Lyra drifted into the center of the well, her silver skin catching the stray beams of Sabine's light. She didn't look at the labels. Instead, she let her fingertips brush against the cold surface of the glass slates, closing her eyes as if listening to a distant vibration. "They aren't coordinates, Sabine," Lyra whispered, her voice carrying that strange, multi-toned resonance through the short-range comms. "They are names. Every star system the Sovereign's gavel has snuffed out. The ledger isn't just a map. It's a graveyard." She stopped her hand over a deeply recessed module near the base of the cylinder. The glass here wasn't black. It was a deep, bruised violet, pulsing with the faint residual heat of a dying battery cell. "This is the core navigation array," Lyra said. "The logs from the outer rim are here." "The extraction." Sabine moved in beside her, pulling a heavy brass-framed data siphon from her utility rig. The device was an antique, a clunky mechanical scrapper's tool built to forcefully pull raw binary data from dead systems by using high-frequency magnetic needles. "Step back," Sabine said, aligning the siphon's heavy contact pins with the violet glass slate. "If there's any residual current left in this housing, it's going to kick." Data siphon engaged. Target: Directorate Crystalline Matrix. Log ID RIM-442. Connection: Unshielded Magnetic Inductive. Transfer rate: 42%, 68%, 85%. The brass gears inside Sabine's siphon whined loudly as the magnetic needles began to violently strip the encrypted data from the glass. In the dark well, the violet slate began to crackle with tiny static spiderwebs of white light, the last remaining fragments of the dreadnought's memory being pulled raw into the scrapper's drive. Audio cue. A sharp, metallic click, click, click as the siphon's physical tally wheels spun forward, registering the massive influx of data. Suddenly, the black glass walls around them began to groan. Deep within the ship's spine, a massive mechanical relay slammed shut. The dead, yellow indicator lights along the data stacks didn't just blink. They flared an angry, blinding amber. "Sabine, the bridge forced the manual reset," Vance shouted over the static, his voice breaking up completely. "The main core is re-energizing. Get out of the well." "The siphon isn't done," Sabine yelled back, her boots slipping on the structural rib as the sudden surge of power created a localized magnetic field that began to pull at her heavy gear. 91%. Come on, you piece of junk." The violet glass slate was glowing brilliantly now, the heat from the forced power surge causing the composite housing to smoke. The brass siphon in Sabine's hands grew scalding hot, the metal vibrating so hard it threatened to tear itself from her grip. Lyra reached out, her silver fingers wrapping directly over Sabine's hands on the siphon's handle. A sudden flash of blue light arced between Lyra's skin and the crystalline drive. For a fraction of a second, the entire sensory core lit up as bright as a dying star. Sabine felt the static charge pass straight through her flight suit, knocking the wind from her lungs as the data siphon gave one final violent thud and went dead. Transfer complete. Log ID RIM-442 successfully scraped. Warning: system power restored to Sector 12. Point defense active. Sabine ripped the smoking siphon from the mount, slamming it into her chest rig as the yellow tracking lasers of the tower's internal defense turrets snapped awake above them, instantly locking onto their signatures. "We got it," Sabine roared, grabbing Lyra by the shoulder harness and kicking off the wall with all the force her magnetic boots could provide. "Marrow, Vance, fall back to the breach. The house is awake." They tumbled through the upper hatch just as a hail of automated fléchette fire chewed the obsidian glass spire behind them into 1,000 glittering shards. Act 1. The Iron Horizon. The airlock didn't cycle. It exploded outward into the void. Sabine and Lyra cleared the threshold of the sensory tower just as a high-velocity slug from an internal security turret punched through the inner seal, sending a jagged spray of molten lead and shredded rubber gaskets whipping past their helmets. Outside, the dreadnought's hull was no longer a silent, dark landscape. It was a blinding, violent plain of reflective armor plates and flashing defensive arrays. The Sovereign's gavel was fully awake, and its great skin was crawling with automated fury. External compass register. Location: Dreadnought Spine, upper tier. Threat vector. Point defense grid active, 88% efficiency. Target destination, Tether Point Alpha, 240 meters. Sabine, the line's snapping. Jarek's voice was barely a whisper through the bone conduction comms, buried under a mountain of screaming electromagnetic interference. The Dreadnought's thrusters are cycling for a short-range correction maneuver. If those main bells fire, the thermal wake will cook Valen's wake down to the ribs. "Don't you cut that cable, Jarek," Sabine snarled, her boots slamming down onto the hull plate, the magnetic clamps catching with a heavy rhythmic clack, clack. "We're on our way. Marrow, where are you?" 200 meters ahead, near the shadow of the primary launch bay, the answer came in a brilliant fountain of white-hot titanium sparks. Marrow and Vance were running hard across the open superstructure, their heavy mining frames kicking up fragments of frozen ammonia ice with every stride. Behind them, 3 spider-like Directorate maintenance drones, each the size of an ore cart, with long pneumatic cutting shears for limbs, were skittering across the vertical armor plates, their lenses glowing an angry, unblinking crimson. "We've got company on the lower terrace," Vance roared, his mechanical arm firing a low-yield rivet blast that caught the leading drone square in its optical sensor, turning the machine into a spinning wreck of scrap metal and hydraulic fluid. "These things aren't security bots, Sabine. They're automated repair units. They think we're structural damage and they're trying to patch us out." "Keep moving," Marrow growled. His armor was still weeping black grease from the electrical blast in the tower, but his massive iron fists were locked around the stock of a salvaged Directorate plasma cutter. He turned on his heel, firing a short, blinding beam of superheated gas that sliced the leg off a second drone, sending it tumbling into the black abyss of space. Act 2. The Crossfire Slide. To reach the tether, Sabine and Lyra had to cross the open gantry of the secondary sensor cluster, a 100-meter stretch of naked steel girder, completely exposed to the ship's automatic point defense turrets. Above them, a triple-barreled rotary flak gun, mounted on the Dreadnought's primary bridge tower, began to sweep downward. Its automated targeting lasers, thin, intersecting ribbons of emerald light, cut through the venting ammonia fog, hunting for their heat signatures. "Lyra, follow my step," Sabine yelled, her eyes locked on the green laser lines sweeping toward them. "When the beam passes, you slide." Time the sweep. The sprint step. Sabine counts the rhythmic sweep of the emerald targeting lasers, waiting for the split-second delay as the turret realigns its tracking mirrors. De-energize magnets. The kinetic drift. She cuts the power to her boot clamps, launching herself into a flat, horizontal slide across the polished armor plating, letting her momentum carry her beneath the turret's minimum depression angle. Re-engage clamps. The hard lock. As she hits the opposite side of the gantry, she snaps the magnetic switches back to full power, her boots locking down with a violent, jarring thud that nearly wrenches her knees from their sockets. Lyra didn't slide. She ran. She moved across the buckled steel plates with that terrifying, frictionless grace, her silver limbs reflecting the flashes of the distant flak fire. The emerald targeting beams washed over her 3 times, but each time the lasers touched her skin, the rotary gun above hitched, its internal tracking algorithms failing to identify her organic-synthetic hybrid silhouette as a hostile target. "The ship is trying to see me," Lyra said, as she dropped down beside Sabine behind the low lip of a structural reinforcement rib. Her silver fingers were twitching against the metal of the hull, sending faint, rhythmic vibrations into the Dreadnought's skin. "It thinks I am a ghost in its own blueprint." "Let's hope it stays confused for another 50 meters, Sabine panted, checking the status indicator on her brass data siphon. The violet light was still pulsing. The stolen navigation logs were secure, but the device was vibrating against her chest like a trapped animal. Suddenly, a massive shudder ran through the entire length of the Sovereign's gavel. The great ship wasn't just turning. Its lower-altitude thrusters had just fired, a massive wall of blue-white ion flame erupting from the underbelly of the vessel. The sheer gravitational distortion tore at Sabine's harness, trying to rip her feet from the hull plates. "Sabine!" Jarek's voice was completely broken by static now, but the panic was clear. "The cables parting. The tension's over. 80 tons. Valen's wake is getting pulled into the thruster arc." "Marrow, break for the lip!" Sabine shouted, scrambling over the structural rib. "We're losing the bridge." Act 2. The Iron U-Turn. The high-tensile copper tether line didn't just break, it detonated. Under the 80-ton strain of the dreadnought's short-range maneuver, the thick metal cable unraveled into thousands of white-hot, whipping wires that snapped across the hull of the Sovereign's gavel. One rogue strand lashed across the superstructure, just 10 feet from Sabine, slicing clean through a thick steel exhaust vent like a razor through canvas. "The line is gone," Jarek's voice cut through a wall of absolute electromagnetic screaming. "Valen's wake is drifting. I'm getting pulled into the thermal wash. I have to clear the thruster arc, or we're cinders." "Go, Jarek! Get the ship out of there!" Sabine roared back, her boots skidding across the frosted plating as the dreadnought's massive sublight engines groaned beneath them. She turned her head, her visor light catching Marrow and Vance. They were pinned down 40 meters away, backed against the secondary sensor array as the final remaining maintenance drone. A heavy, multi-limbed monstrosity with a spinning circular bone saw for an arm advanced on them, sparks flying from its rusted tread units. "Captain, we don't have the velocity to jump the gap without a line," Marrow growled, his voice a low, mechanical rattle. He was holding his cracked chest plate together with his left hand, his right swinging a heavy iron pry bar at the drone's sensory lens. "We're stuck on the mountain." "No, we're not," Sabine said, her eyes snapping toward the dark, yawning cavern of the secondary launch bay they had just abandoned. The manual override Marrow had executed had left the bay doors jammed half open. "We're going back into the belly. Marrow, Vance, fall back to the hangar. We're stealing a ride." The blind retreat. Crossing the hull in reverse was a frantic, uncoordinated scramble against the ship's increasing centrifugal pull. The Sovereign's gavel was banking hard now, turning its colossal nose toward the upper atmosphere of the rim planet below. Die for the lip, the magnetic release. Sabine disengages her hip clamps entirely, letting the centrifugal tilt of the banking dreadnought slide her body down the sloped armor, plating toward the launch bay opening. "Anchor the team, the heavy catch." Marrow catches the edge of the jammed blast door with his iron fingers, creating a human anchor point for Vance and Lyra as they tumble through the narrow gap into the zero-gravity interior. "Seal the bay." The airlock slam. Sabine drops through the opening last, using the butt of her scattergun to smash the manual emergency close lever on the interior wall, sealing the half-open bay door just as a volley of point defense flak hits the exterior hull. The launch bay was pitch black once more, smelling of ozone and the burnt copper from Marrow's high-voltage cut. Floating in the dead center of the bay were the 3 triangular Directorate interceptors, still locked into their heavy charging overhead racks. Because Marrow had fried the auxiliary lines, the ships were completely cold, their glass canopies dark, their weapon systems unpowered. "They're dead iron, Sabine," Vance panted, his mechanical arm throwing off a cloud of gray smoke as his internal cooling reservoir began to leak. "The bridge completely isolated this sector's power grid after we blew the trunk. You can't start the internal reactor without a primary command sequence from their central network." We don't need the central network, Sabine said, floating toward the nearest interceptor's underbelly. She unlatched the brass data siphon from her chest rig. The violet glass slate inside was still hot, humming with the raw, compressed navigational data they had stolen from the sensory tower. The siphon didn't just pull the logs, Vance. It pulled the system's baseline verification keys. She rammed the siphon's heavy contact pins directly into the fighter's unshielded diagnostic port. "Lyra, talk to it," Sabine commanded. "Give it the cord." Lyra drifted to the canopy of the interceptor, her bare silver hands pressing flat against the reinforced obsidian glass. Her eyes flared a bright liquid white, reflecting the tiny, frantic streams of binary code that suddenly began to scroll across the fighter's dead cockpit displays. Act 3. The Internal Ignition. The interceptor groaned. It wasn't the sound of an engine catching, it was the sound of 1,000 frozen relays being shocked back to life by the stolen verification keys. Across the cockpit displays, amber warnings flickered to a steady, predatory green. The fighter's internal diagnostic voice, a cold, digitized feminine tone, began to pulse through the bay's dead calm speakers, announcing the system's return to consciousness. System initialization complete. Authorization verified. Command-level access. Status: primary weapon systems online. "She's awake!" Vance yelled, his mechanical arm whirring as he frantically checked the fighter's weapon loadout. "But the launch bay doors are electronically fused from the bridge. The manual override gears are locked out." "Then we don't open the door," Sabine growled, sliding into the pilot's seat. She felt the cold, hard contact of the controls against her gauntlets. The interface wasn't meant for humans. It was a tight, neurolinked rig designed for the Directorate's pilot drones. She forced her hands into the restraints, feeling the painful pinch of the sync needles pricking her skin. "We delete the door." "Sabine, the bay is airtight," Jarek warned through the comms. "If you fire a high-yield concussion round inside that hangar, the back pressure will liquefy our lungs." "Then get behind the interceptor's heat shield," Sabine shouted, her eyes locked on the targeting reticle projecting onto the dark hangar bay doors. "Marrow, Vance, clamp onto the landing struts. Now!" The two Scrap-Born miners didn't hesitate. They slammed their magnetic boots onto the interceptor's struts, their massive, heavy frames acting as ballast as the fighter's engines began to whine with the high-pitched, terrifying oscillation of an ion core ignition. The concussion breach. Sabine flicked the safety toggle for the fighter's internal defense payload, a pair of short-range thermobaric demolition missiles mounted to the wing roots intended for bunker busting. "Targeting set," Sabine muttered, her knuckles white inside the restraints. "Lyra, if you have a prayer, start reciting it." She punched the trigger release. The fighter didn't just fire, it surged forward, the ion thrusters burning a hole through the floor plating of the bay before the missiles had even left their rails. The two thermobaric warheads hit the center of the heavy blast doors at near point-blank range. The resulting explosion wasn't a blast, it was an atmospheric collapse. The heat of the thermobaric charge instantly consumed every cubic inch of oxygen in the hangar, creating a momentary, perfect vacuum that pulled the blast doors outward, bending the hardened steel like tin foil. Then the pressure wave struck. It was a physical wall of force that hit the interceptor with the weight of a freight train. The fighter was slammed toward the open gap, its landing gear screaming as the structural rails of the hangar bay buckled inward. Structural impact. The blast wave. The thermobaric wave shatters the reinforced door latches, sending a rain of white-hot shrapnel whistling past the interceptor's wings. Exhausted ejection. The vacuum pull. The air in the hangar is ripped into the void, pulling the interceptor out through the jagged, smoking hole in the dreadnought's hull. Ignition sequence. The burn. Sabine slams the throttle to the stop, forcing the ion engines to flare into full burn as they clear the dreadnought's skin. The interceptor shot out into the star-strewn void of the scrap belt like a bullet from a firing range. The ship didn't fly smoothly. It shuddered, its wings fighting against the massive gravitational wake of the Sovereign's gavel. Behind them, the dreadnought's primary rail cannon was already rotating, its barrel glowing a violent, pulsating violet as it tracked the small, fast-moving heat signature of the stolen interceptor. "They've got a lock!" Vance screamed, clutching his mechanical arm to his chest as the fighter banked violently to the left. "They can't lock what they can't see," Sabine said, her voice strained by the G-force. She reached over and smashed the button for the ship's emergency chaff dispenser. A cloud of glittery, radar-absorbent metallic tape exploded out from behind the interceptor's exhaust, creating a massive, shimmering screen of interference that scrambled the dreadnought's fire control sensors. The violet light of the rail cannon shot across the void, missing their cockpit by a mere dozen meters. The displaced air of the near miss tossed the interceptor through the debris field, sending them tumbling toward the dark, inviting shadow of the nearby Valen's wake. "Jarek," Sabine yelled into the comms, "open the main cargo bay. If you don't catch us, we're going to bounce off the hull and turn into space dust." "I've got the doors open, Captain." Jarek's voice was the sweetest sound in the universe. "Bring her home."